The Battle of Callinicum, AD 531, is often overshadowed by its big brother, Dara, AD 530. However, I believe a similar topographic treatment can be applied to the battle. The image on screen is a picture that I hadn't been given permission to use in time for my Dara video, but it allows a suitable segue now. Many thanks to Ancient Warfare magazine. See the description for the full citation. The image shows the Hunnic leader Sunekas charging and personally killing the Persian standard-bearer of Baras Manas, which led up to the rout of the Persian left and a decisive Roman victory. After Dara, the Persians tried a different approach for invasion. Just so you know, I will be animating the battle in this video, however I won't be animating armies on the following static maps, as it would give a misleading sense of time and so cause and effect. You may remember this map by Wikimedia user C. Placidus, where I talked about Dara being opposite Nisibis and so controlling the invasion route into Roman Syria. The Persian spring invasion, somewhere near Circesium in the south, at the suggestion and with the assistance of the Lakhmid ruler Al-Mundir III, is the exception that proves the rule. To quote Procopius at the beginning of Book 1, Chapter 18 of the History of the Wars, quote, "This was the first invasion made by the Persians from this point into Roman soil, as far as we know from any tradition or by any other means, and it paralysed all the Romans with fear by its unexpectedness." End quote. Now, the first stage of the Persian route is very speculative, with different contemporary authors putting different emphasis on various places and so different routes. Let's switch over to Google Earth Pro to have a bit more of a look. This first representation of the Persian route, the black line, was from my first reading of Procopius and John Malalas. The Persians crossed the river Euphrates from east to west, and to quote Procopius, "After passing over some uninhabited country," end quote, which I took to mean the southern side of the Syrian desert, and now to Malalas, they, quote, "appeared at Callinicum, a city in Osroene, having come by way of Circesium. There is then agreement in the sources that the Persians reached a fortress called Gabula, or Gabulon, which they may or may not have taken. By this point, the Romans, under Belisarius, marked as the Red Path, had essentially force-marched from Dara to Chalcis by way of the Roman road system. I don't believe that it's known when the news of this invasion reached Dara, and so when Belisarius responded. As I said before, it would be misleading to animate this section. The Romans who reached Chalcis were primarily made up of cavalry, as some troops, presumably the infantry, were garrisoned in various Roman cities en route to prevent a Persian invasion through the normal way past Dara. So you know, there is a hint of a suggestion that Dara was besieged in this year, 531, as well. But that's beyond the scope of this video. I would like to thank Christopher Lillington-Martin for his invaluable help with suggesting the Roman route based on a map of Roman roads and a better reading of the sources. If you were listening carefully, I mentioned that the black path was my route suggestion. Now, here's Chris's suggestion of a route, with the Persians now in blue. Similarly, the Persians are first mentioned at Circesium. However, for him, he feels that they crossed from south to north. Now, the uninhabited land is due to the fact that this is the Roman-Persian border region, and especially it's uninhabited because there's been 5 years of war by 531. The Persians would then move along the north bank of the Euphrates River, pillaging and raiding what they could until reaching Callinicum. From there, somehow, they make it to Gabulon by a route I've represented as a crossing near Callinicum or Sura, crossing by Barbarissos, or conceivably further north. It's worth emphasising that the large lake on the screen is the modern Lake Assad, created by the Tabqa Dam in 1974, and so we cannot use Google Earth to suggest the easiest geographic crossing point. Not to mention that there could have been some bridges across the Euphrates, which a more detailed map of the Roman road network could suggest. From here, Chris, the sources, and I are all in agreement that the Persians began retreating along the south bank of the Euphrates, with the Romans shadowing their retreat to the extent that, to quote Procopius, In the spot where the Persians bivouacked each night, the Romans always tarried on the following night. The route on screen is schematic. It would look a bit weird to have the armies marching through the Al-Asad Lake, but essentially they stuck to the southern riverbank. Easter in AD 531 was approaching. On the night of April the 18th, which was Good Friday, the Roman army encamped at Sura. The battle itself occurred on April the 19th, which was Easter Saturday. The Romans took their Christianity very seriously and had been reportedly fasting for the entirety of Good Friday and also on the morning of Easter Saturday. Their lack of mealtime could explain how the Romans were able to catch up with the Persians, where one assumes that it would be nigh impossible for the Romans to catch up to an enemy army which had a head start, all else being equal. The men reportedly agitated to fight the Persians, with Procopius, a pro-Belisarius source, stating that he, along with the other officers, attempted to persuade the men otherwise. However, Pseudo-Zachariah Rhetor, translated by Geoffrey Greatrex, suggests that Belisarius was persuaded by his men's religious fervour against his officers' wishes. You may make your own mind up, however, I do favour Procopius's judgment in this matter, as Belisarius was perfectly aware that, firstly, the Persians were retreating without any need to fight a battle. Secondly, the Romans had been fasting, and thirdly, that the pace of the march had caused some of the Roman infantry to straggle behind. Chris has come up with an alternative idea. The Persians allowed the Romans to catch up to them, and so fight a battle which was favourable to them. They should have been aware that the Romans were fasting, the Persian force was moving through Christian lands and may have had a few Christians in its ranks. By being reached possibly by 11 AM, 12 PM, the Persians were well rested from staying put whilst the Romans had marched roughly 15 kilometres, and the Persians would have eaten a hearty breakfast. Pseudo-Zachariah Rhetor states that a wind blew from behind the Persians toward the Roman lines, which would have helped with the arrow exchange during the battle. Finally, this may have been the first section of suitable terrain during the retreat for the Persian force, which may have been comprised of entirely cavalry. Let's now look at the terrain. This is a view from Google Earth Pro looking east, so the Persians would be further away and the Romans closer to the camera. Once again, Chris was the one to tell me that we could locate the precise site of the battle and so look at the topography, and he provided me with his research notes on the deployment, so literally everything from here is essentially cited to some piece of his prior work. Now, there aren't as many good photos of the terrain in this area, as Raqqa has been, until very recently, the capital of IS's declared caliphate, and before then the Syrian civil war had been very active. You'll have to believe me when I say that the River Euphrates' floodplain is almost perfectly flat and level, and that those cliffs you can see on the right hand side are about 50 metres tall. Many representations, such as Wikipedia here, excuse the lack of English, show an incline on the southern portion of the map, where the Lakhmid and Ghassanid Arabs faced off against each other. This is due to a reading of Procopius, Book 1, Chapter 18, line 26. Quote, "He, Belisarius, then formed the phalanx," meaning mixed infantry and cavalry formation, "with a single front, disposing his men as follows. On the left wing by the river, he stationed all the infantry, while on the right, where the ground rose sharply, he placed Arethas and all his Saracens, Ghassanid Arabs. He," Belisarius again, "himself, with all the cavalry, took his position in the centre." Other people have interpreted this quote as there being some sort of slope on the right-hand side, with the implication that the Persian flanking force would eventually be charging downhill onto the Roman centre's right flank. But no, Procopius very literally meant where the ground rose sharply. There are some 50-metre cliffs. Procopius also said that Belisarius formed a single front, so the Arabs must have been part of a continuous line on the plain, rather than being separated and on the elevated desert. Back to the geography. This site is further validated by the existence of islands in the middle of the river, which Procopius mentions that some Roman troops fled to after the battle went poorly for them. One final note before we start the battle itself. Any understanding of meandering rivers and the simple usage of easily available satellite time lapses of the area will inform you that the river does move, and would have moved doubly so before the Tabqa Dam was made. That's why there are steep cliffs and a perfectly flat floodplain. A consequence of this is that the actual site's width of the plain where the battle was fought is very likely not the same as it once was. So this terrain is representative of the site of the battle and suits us well for an animation, but it is not identical to how it was in 531, in contrast to how we believe the terrain shown in the Dara video is. The Persians are recorded as having 15,000 men, led by a man who Procopius calls Azarethes, and having 5,000 Arab Lakhmid allies under Al-Mundir, for a total of 20,000, and it's assumed that the Persian force was entirely cavalry. Procopius gives the Romans 20,000 combined foot and horse, with some additional number of Ghassanid allies under Oorthuys. Malalas initially gives Belisarius 3,000 cavalry, plus 5,000 Arab allies under Oorthuys, being joined by some 8,000 men under Sunnikas and Simus. Depending on who you believe, and if you mix and match sources, this gives a total paper strength of somewhere between 16,000 to 25,000. I lean towards Procopius here and would assume that the Romans slightly outnumbered the Persians in numbers, if not in cavalry. But remember that some significant number of Roman infantry were missing, and that the Romans have marched at least 15 kilometres, with their forces having been heavily fasting on both food and, reportedly, water. The battle seems to have started late morning to early afternoon, as the Romans had to march perhaps 4 to 6 hours to reach the site, and sunrise occurs at about 6 a.m. Procopius and Zachariah record an arrow exchange, with Procopius stating that the Romans had the better of it on account of their stiffer bows, but Zachariah records that the wind blew against the Romans, and so that the Persians actually had the better of it. After 2/3 of the day, Procopius, Book 1, Chapter 18, line 35, probably between 2 and 3 p.m, the Persians moved their best men to their left wing, or to the Roman right, and charged. Remember the tactic that was used in Dara, where the immortal cavalry had shifted to their left wing and then charged the Roman right, trying to overload one flank. It's possible that we see a similar thing happening at Callinicum. So the Persians have now shifted their best men to lie opposite the Roman right. The Persian left then charges and routed the Ghassanids soon after contact, according to Malalas. From here, the Persians immediately began to fold around the Romans. Large portions of the army, both infantry and cavalry, began to flee to the islands in the middle of the river. Of the cavalry commanders, Belisarius and the Hun Ascan held their position until some of Ascan's men began to flee, and Ascan, along with 800 of his other men, were killed. Belisarius retreated to what little remained of the infantry, which had secured itself against the river. Procopius records that Belisarius and his cavalry dismounted here and held the formation, whereas Malalas, an anti-Belisarius source, records that Belisarius fled across the river in a boat, and that Simus and Sunnikas, who we saw at the very beginning of this video, stayed with the infantry. I favour Procopius's version of events here. Regardless, the infantry now held and resisted all attacks, repelling them with effective arrow shooting, whilst being able to take cover behind a rigid, unyielding barricade of shields. Furthermore, the noise of men bashing on their shields perturbed the Persian horses during their cavalry assaults. By nightfall, which was about 6 p.m, the Persians retreated to their camp, and the Roman army extricated itself from the field by boat or by swimming. The Persians had technically won the field, however, it was a Pyrrhic tactical victory, with Procopius stating that as many Persians died as did Romans, and they were unable to use their cavalry to run down large portions of the routing Romans. As the Persians left the Roman lands soon after, they cannot be described as being able to capitalise on this in any way, and so I would class Callinicum as a strategic draw. Belisarius should be commended for his personal bravery, however he should be criticised for either allowing his men to fight against his better judgment, or being persuaded to a position of poorer judgment. Accordingly, Belisarius isn't quite in the top rung of Roman or Byzantine commanders, in my opinion, as he lost battles, such as Callinicum, that he had the choice not to fight. Many thanks again to Christopher Lillington-Martin, who has helped me immensely with my understanding of this battle by giving me advance access to and discussing his ongoing research. Lillington-Martin, Christopher, 2018, The Battle of Callinicum, brackets, Al-Raqqa, Syria, 531. Unpublished manuscript, Oxford, UK. And there are drafts available, see the description, and go watch our half-hour interview on the Battle of Dara, 530, and the animation I made, and links will all be in the description. Thank you very much, everyone.